Thank you very much. Okay, perfect. So as someone who started out as a historical archaeologist and then quickly moved into contemporary archaeology, I've spent a lot of time in the last sort of 10, 15 years thinking about how the past is in constant dialogue with the present. And in their book, After Modernity, John Schofield and Rodney Harrison, which was quite an influential book for me, describe archaeology as a creation of the past in the present through a process that draws on material evidence. And Dacia Viejo-Rose, who I now work with at Cambridge, describes heritage as an assemblage that includes material and immaterial forms, representations, aspirations, mortar, emotions, values and interpretations, symbols and narratives. So my research and teaching operate very much at the intersection of contemporary archaeology and critical heritage studies. And as such, I kind of spend a lot of time thinking and talking and writing about issues that transcend and cross-cut these really closely related disciplines, issues to do with identity, community, public participation, capitalism, globalization, colonial legacy, capitalism, and did I mention capitalism? Archaeology and heritage interpretations, they change according to new ideas and new technologies. So in that amazing tome that Bruce Trigger wrote, The History of Archaeological Thought, I think it really struck me. He describes how it wasn't really until the 16th century in Northern Europe that there was any kind of concept that there might be a pre-Roman, pre-history in the UK. And even now, school children can tell you, yeah, dinosaurs and all sorts. And so knowledge changes. The things that we know about the past change according to what's going on at our time. So these kind of new scientific ideas and knowledge back then, developed. That's how natural science and later social science developed. And I think when we think now, what's happening and how is it changing, archaeologists are finally working with indigenous knowledge, and indigenous people are becoming archaeologists. And so those kind of conversations are really changing the way that not only the way that we think about the past, but also how we can start to think about the future and plan for the future. And one of those things that's really struck me personally a lot in the last sort of 20 years, and I don't think it's just because as you get older you become a bit more sort of nostalgic, but there's a rapid extinction happening. We see it all the time in insects, trees, birds, mammals, languages, ways of life. Entire cultures, whole peoples are becoming extinct at an alarming rate. And I think this is a particularly difficult, unpredictable time of heightened anxiety, when the future doesn't really sit on the horizon as it did perhaps for my grandparents, as the future is somewhere better. The future now sits as this place that's quite terrifying in many ways. And certainly among my students, there are young people who tell me that they're prepared to be arrested, that they're not going to have children because they feel that they don't actually believe the world will be habitable when in their lifetime. And so for all these reasons, I really think that as archaeologists we have to get involved. Archaeology is unavoidably political, and I will thump you if you say it's not. I won't actually thump you, but I'll thump you intellectually. But I want to suggest that Larry Zimmerman wrote a paper that John cited it last week at Cambridge, but it's been cited a lot, and he talks about how archaeologists' knowledge needs to be translational. We need to be able to translate what we find and what we know so that more people can understand. Because actually what we're speaking about is really relevant to equality, to people's ability to be their full self today. If you haven't got a past, if you can't see yourself in the past, it's very difficult to defend your right to exist today and into the future. And so I think for all these reasons that if we really do want a planet that we can pass on and that's sustainable, we have to get involved. So I'll give you a bit of background to my random waffling. From 2010 to 2014, I did my doctoral research at York under John's expert supervision. And that really involved working with contemporary homeless people, first of all in Bristol and then York, to document or co-document together how homeless people used the city. So how did they see the city, and what was important to them, and what was significant, and where did they find shelter, but also the stories that they told about the city, which was very often to do with the built environment or the sort of memories of the way that those places had been used. And then we were using established archaeological methods. We were doing field walking and surface collection, and then methods drawn from anthropology and cultural heritage, so things like memory mapping and semi-structured interviews. And through this, we worked out or located routes that people had used through the city, and then having sort of layered maps on top of each other, we're able to recognise that there's some parts of the city which were basically homeless places. And then we excavated Turbo Island, which is in Bristol, which was a tract of land synonymous with homelessness and had been since kind of post-war period. And then we excavated a place just outside Bootham Park Hospital grounds in York, where homeless people had also taken shelter. And we kind of were able to establish that how those sites had been used and occupied, partly through talking with homeless people, many of whom were able to remember, but also through things like using best before dates on drug packaging and on biscuits and on fast food packaging. So it was typically archaeological and not. And then towards the end of my PhD, I came to meet more and more people who were homeless or failed asylum seekers. Or more correctly, there were people whose asylum claims had been rejected by the UK government, and then through that had become criminalised through what Monish Bhatia wryly terms crimmigration. And so once they had had their asylum claim rejected, people either were deported or some people evaded deportation. And of course, for those who evaded it, they had no choice but to try and exist on the margins of so-called mainstream society. And that left them really open to, often these people are the most traumatised and vulnerable, but it leaves them really open to exploitation. And Zygmunt Bauman theorises this in a book called Wasted Lives, where he talks about how, in the same way that we have huge amounts of waste of things and material and food, we also have wasted humans. And that's really how he theorises camps, detention centre camps. And I was going to give you a sort of mini history of camps, but I decided not to. Read my book, because it'll be in there. Anyway, as I neared the end of my PhD, it became really clear to me that what I had characterised as homelessness was actually part of the domestic part of this much bigger story of basically global land enclosure, theft by people in power, or forced displacement. And so I'm going to talk a bit more about my recently completed British Academy funded project. But essentially what I set out to do was to try and work collaboratively with displaced people in Europe. And I specifically was interested to find out, are there better places to be displaced in Europe? And so when I wrote my funding application in 2016, the hotspots were the UK and Greece and Sweden and Hungary. And I also felt that those four places would offer a kind of loose four corners of Europe, like northeast, southwest. Obviously, things in policy and the whole situation with displacement moves much faster than academic grant funding cycles do. And actually, as it turned out, COVID-19 meant that I didn't go to Hungary at all. But I did spend months working in squats and camps and day centres in Plymouth in the UK, and rural northern Sweden, and in Athens in Greece. So I'm going to just scoot over a bit of the kind of theoretical context for that project. I've crossed out number 8. I don't want to cross out decent work, but I do want to cross out economic growth. So in 2001, Australian independent scholar John Hawkes published a pamphlet called The Fourth Pillar of Sustainability, Culture's Essential Role in Public Planning. The first 3 pillars had been kind of since the 1970s, economic growth, social welfare and environmental health. And you can call me a member of the toffee-eating, Guardian-reading Wokerati if you want to, although actually I read the FT, surprising. But I very much agree with Isabel Stengers, because I think that the idea that we can grow our way economically out of climate disaster is insane. So anyway, in his essay, or in his pamphlet, John Hawkes says it's through cultural action that we humans make sense of our existence and the environment that we inhabit. And it's through cultural action that we define our common values and universal needs. And it's through cultural action that we try to address these things. These kind of challenges, such as the climate emergency and rising sea levels, rising temperatures, but also unprecedented mass human displacement. And these things are really not separate issues. And I want to try and convince you that as archaeologists who have, studying migration patterns is quite common for us, but I really think we need to get involved in these kind of we need to use our archaeological knowledge to get involved in these contemporary debates. Climate chaos is a growing push factor for people migrating globally. It increasingly contributes to why people become displaced in the first place. So of the people I was working with, most of those people are displaced through war or conflict, from places like Syria, Afghanistan, Iran, Eritrea, Sudan. But particularly in kind of South America and lots of parts of Africa, millions of people are becoming displaced through climate change and sort of rapidly worsening environments and sort of devastation such as drought, famine, flood, soil degradation, loss of traditional food sources, but also the loss of rights to hunt or fish or gather in forests and on plains, which are increasingly disappearing, not just due to climate disaster, but rapidly expanded privatisation of resources that are absolutely essential for life, things like water. So, for example, in Colombia, but also India, Australia, South Africa, all over the world, there are really countless examples of particularly indigenous, but often local people being displaced by multinationals, such as mining companies and prospectors. And if this sounds a bit sort of old-fashioned, it's because basically colonialism hasn't ended. It just sort of rebranded itself as globalisation. This is a bit depressing. I have to read these facts. So the UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, estimates that there are now 103 million displaced people globally. And when I did a similar lecture to this a year ago, that figure was 80 million. And so that's 23 million more people in 1 year. And the war in Ukraine accounts for about 5.4 million. Venezuela has produced similar numbers in the last year. What it comes down to is that 36% of people globally who are displaced are living in 5 countries, in Turkey, Colombia, Germany, Pakistan and Uganda. And put more broadly, that means that lower middle income countries host 74% of the world's displaced people, which is completely unsustainable. And of course the actual figure of the number of people displaced is probably much larger, because to be displaced from your home is to enter this really highly uncertain form of permanent transience, or Dan Hicks and Sarah Mallett used the phrase permanent temporariness. And the levels of transience and precarity involved with displacement, combined with this unbelievably complex bureaucratic nature of its official recording, means that it's really difficult to be accurate with global numbers. But basically, it's estimated by some scholars that by the end of this century, 10% of the world's global population will be displaced, which is about 1 billion people. And you can see from the graph that the numbers are going in one direction. And so one thing is absolutely certain, and that's that building walls and paying the French to monitor the coast isn't going to cut it. Because people will try to get to parts of the world where better opportunities are afforded. And they're afforded as direct legacies of colonialism, legacies that post-medieval archaeologists, historical archaeologists, contemporary archaeologists, we have the data and the skills to expose and unpack this, and we also have the expertise that might usefully contribute to contemporary reparation debates and demands. I'm thinking here particularly about the recent scathing comments made by the Barbados Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, at COP27, when she said, she's speaking about Black Caribbean people, We were the ones whose blood, sweat and tears financed the Industrial Revolution. Are we now to face double jeopardy by having to pay the cost as a result of those greenhouse gases from the Industrial Revolution? So she was speaking about these very high costs of development borrowing, and the need to rebuild after weather events which are basically caused by climate warming, and how these are the things actually that archaeological data could actually could help with, I think. So in sort of framing this recent research that I've done, I've been thinking a lot with, I've been using a lot of Anna Singh, Donna Haraway, Isabel Stengers. And I very much frame my current research in terms of, into the material culture of contemporary human displacement in Europe. It's quite a long title. Through a broadly kind of post-capitalist feminist lens, with a real focus on storytelling as a political tool. Storytelling as a way to increase public scientific knowledge and a way to better understand and to convey better the interconnectedness of our biggest global challenges. Singh's work has been particularly influential on me. She, in her 2015 book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, it's very readable. And so she's very carefully weaving together these stories about humans and non-humans. Basically, it's about this matsutake mushroom, which is very highly prized in Japanese culture. And so she tells this story of destruction of landscapes, of soil degradation, of exploitation of Asian American migrant workers who work to pick the mushrooms where it grows in North America, and then it's shipped across to Japan. So through these stories, which are very familiar to topics that archaeologists study, people, landscapes, technologies, transport, consumption, roots, behaviours, soil and mushrooms, she explores these multiple effects of kind of Marxist alienation and globalisation, but it's told through a story, so suddenly you can connect these things together in a more effective way. And combining this with Donna Haraway's very explicitly feminist materialist approach, particularly from sort of Cyborg Manifesto in the 1980s to her more recent work on string figures and staying with the trouble, I think it's really useful to think about this, the idea of the rhizome, which is kind of Deleuze's French philosopher idea of the rhizome. But actually, ironically, Deleuze is actually more like mycelium, because he pops up all over the place, like technology studies, science over here, social studies, anthropologists, everyone's got a bit of Deleuze. So this kind of rhizome analogy is quite useful for trying to understand the problems that appear to have no obvious beginning or end. And they're problems that have to be understood as being connected through what Stengers would call an open system, or what Bruno Latour would call networked. And of course, to say everything's connected, it's all entwined, it's unimaginable on its own, is kind of not very helpful, particularly if we're trying to address a particular problem in isolation. Everything gets too big for us to hold in our human mind, or my human mind, definitely. But I think that's rather the point, because these things like climate chaos, like global poverty, like mass human displacement, they require coordinated efforts to understand and address. And actually, I feel like we understand them quite well. It's the coordinating the en masse address that's much more difficult to do. And so that's why I like Anna Singh's work particularly, because she uses storytelling, which is this method that's common to human cultures throughout time across the globe. And it's a method that's accessible to us at human scale. Children can understand stories. And it's a method that Donna Haraway, citing the Agta people in the Philippines, who are a modern hunter-gatherer group, she suggests it may well have been absolutely fundamental to promoting organisation and cooperation in human evolution. So another French philosopher, Alina Wiam, says that through storytelling we make sense of the world and engage in speculation and politics. Stories can, of course, also be made up. They can be fictional, they can be fantasy. But I want to suggest that using uncompromisingly materialist approaches, using archaeology, we can stay really close to our archaeological data. We can stay close to the megaliths that hurt when we kick them, the flint scatters and mosaics. We can stay close to the blackness and the femaleness of a skeleton in a high-status burial. We can stay close to the wattle daub, to the vaulted ceiling, to the decommissioned nuclear bunker, boarded-up factory used by skaters, graffitied underpass that's also somebody's home. So sticking with our archaeological data, we actually have something true. We have something that exists, even if the dominant rhetoric is that it never did. And to do this work is to engage in what Deleuze, who draws on Henri Bergson, called, rather fabulously, fabulation. So for Deleuze, fabulation is a kind of voice in the middle. It's a collective offering, and it can help to rematerialise those elements of life which capitalism and globalisation steamroller right over. Ultimately, all archaeology involves this ancient practice of storytelling at some point, and it's in this regard that I like Ursula Le Guin's carrier bag theory of fiction, which was first published in 1986 and republished more recently with an introduction by Donna Haraway. So Le Guin's carrier bag of fiction was inspired by the carrier bag theory of human evolution, which was proposed in the 1970s by Elizabeth Fisher, who's an anthropologist, when she was doing feminist research on early human development. And Le Guin's mini essay essentially reimagines the ascent of man, humans, with the carrier bag as the kind of primary cultural device. So it's an early technology of modern humans. And Le Guin's essay begins by making the point that for most early humans, actually it wasn't meat that kept us alive, it was fruit and nuts and seeds. And so the meat gathering hero has kind of overshadowed the gatherer in the story. So she sets out to redress this balance. And Le Guin imagines, rather like my children if I send them to go and get peas, that most humans would probably have just eaten their fill straight off the vine. But then what happens when you need to take something back to your camp or to your home? You need a carrier bag. Or in Le Guin's words, she says, a leaf, a gourd, a shell, a net, a bag, a sling, a sack, a bottle, a pot, a box, a container, a holder, a recipient. Archaeology. So these pictures are from my current project, or just almost finished project. I think it's really useful to think about what we do as archaeologists when we gather fragments. You know, we engage in surface collection, whatever our period or speciality. We're gathering bits, practically or metaphorically, and then we use those things to tell stories. So the carrier bag analogy is particularly useful when working with displaced people, because so often among the people that I work with, actually all they have is, if they're lucky, a bag or a suitcase with everything that they own in the world. In some cases it's just a coat pocket or a small wallet. And Lambros Malaforis, who's at Oxford, he's shown that we can't have memories that don't have any kind of physicality to them. You know, close your eyes for a minute, try and think of a memory that has no physical element to it. It's impossible. So our memories are always located somewhere physical, and they're situated in a particular time. So I'm kind of interested in trying to write about what does that mean for people whose memories, most of their entire memories, are located in places that don't actually exist physically anymore, or they've been so completely smashed or broken or taken over or stolen. They're places that people can't return to. Most of the people that I work with can't return home because either they have refugee status, which comes with the very high price of not being allowed to return to where you fled from, excuse me, or because they would be killed if they went there. And so most of the people with whom I work, these kind of small bags or suitcases or small belongings that they've still got, the objects themselves function as memory vessels. That's all that remains of the kind of physicality of their life's memories. So here from left to right you see Gunel with the suitcases. Gunel's from Azerbaijan, and she got elected as an MP in Azerbaijan, and then she stood up and said, "I will make women's rights," and then the next day some men tried to kill her. So she had to flee to the UK, and she fled with her daughter and 2 suitcases. And the biggest difference, or the hardest thing for Gunel, is actually that she went from very high status, lots of cars and kind of gold and fancy life in Azerbaijan, and being highly respected, well, by some people. And now she lives she's lucky, I suppose, but she now lives in in council accommodation in Plymouth, and nobody knows who she is, and no one will let her practice law. And so actually what she's lost is a huge part of her identity. It's difficult to kind of comprehend, really. And then The middle picture is the first photo that Abdul Rahman took when he first arrived in Sweden, and this wallet is all he had with his various bits of documents and tickets, and that was the first photograph he took of Sweden. And then this bag belongs to Hassan, and he walked from northeast Syria to Sweden, where he now lives in Stockholm. But everything he brought with him, apart from what he was actually wearing, fitted into this bag. So when I first began working with people who are displaced in camps and squats and temporary accommodation, sometimes outside on the street, literally homeless, particularly in Athens and Plymouth, when I spent some time kind of volunteering and working in sort of solidarity spaces, so kitchens, like cultural kitchens and squats and day centres, so people kind of got to know me. And that helped to build trust. But I would at some point ask, is there anything that you have with you that's come on your whole journey? Is there anything that you have that came from home? And very often the answer is no, absolutely nothing, I don't have anything. And then slowly, almost everyone said, oh, I do have this. And it would be very small, often flat, or things that could be put in a pocket. Very often sort of what looked like utilitarian or objects not particularly of very high value economically. But here you can see, so on the left there's a bag of phone adapters, and this is actually so sweet because it belonged to a chap called Jamil who now lives in Sweden, but he'd been given this small bag of adapters in a camp somewhere in Greece, and then he realised that he could be useful because people were always trying to charge their various devices or phones, and they never had the right plug or the right device. And actually holding on to this little bag of adapters meant that he was able to be useful, able to help people, which he said helped him. And then the second picture is a green bracelet which belongs to Hamid, who now also lives in Sweden. And that was on his wrist right until he signed a tenancy agreement where he could actually stay living in Sweden. Because it was when he had walked from Syria with another chap, and they'd walked together to Izmir to get the rubber boats. And then once they got to Izmir, the smugglers, they always pick sort of the fittest, youngest men, and they make them drive the boats. And so they said, you drive that boat, you drive that boat. So they got separated, and as they were separated, Hamid's friend ripped his t-shirt, tied this round his wrist and blessed it and said, good luck, mate. So it really is quite affecting. So it's a small piece of cotton, but it's become so much more on its journey. And then the phone belongs to a chap whose name I can't give you because he doesn't have any right to be in Europe, but that's all he has, and everything in the world. He described it to me as everything in the world. And then this is Baha's Syrian banknote, which was the last of a bundle of notes his dad gave him when he set off on his journey to Europe, and he said he'll keep it in his wallet because it's his last sort of tangible physical connection to his father. So I think the main thing to take away from this is that, and what I'm kind of writing about at the moment, is how all of these things, they're performing mnemonic roles. They are transformed as a result of the journeys that these things have been on. And that's why we called the project Made in Migration. At the very start of doing this research, I wanted to make sure that I was working with people, not on them. And so, I worked in places like the Pamparaki warehouse in Athens, which is unbelievably massive. It's a basketball stadium, and what you see here are the boxes and boxes and boxes, all this stuff that people donated, which was very kind. Most of it came from kind of northwestern Europe. I sent stuff there before I even knew where it was going. But that's kind of where it ends up. And then there's squatters and solidarity activists and displaced people and random researchers kind of undoing boxes and folding and sorting into age and size and season. And the problem we had was that we just didn't have the funding to distribute it as widely as we wanted to. So there's more shots of inside Pamparaki. Sometimes there were some really weird things, like I opened one box and there was an ice skate, and someone else had a beekeeper's suit and a wedding dress, and you're like, one ice skate, like, thanks. Yeah. And so I also worked in various places where, like this is inside the squat in Polytechnion, which has a very fascinating long history as a squat. But you can see how, because it was a university building, you can see how when I was there towards the end of 2019, the character of the squats change all the time. And when I was there towards the end of 2019, it was predominantly West African, French-speaking West African people, and they had made kind of private spaces by turning desks on their side. But it was pretty desperate at this point. It was December, it was cold, and there were women having babies, and there wasn't enough food, and there was no mattresses, and all I could do really was run around trying to give people food and blankets. It was, yeah, pretty dark. I've forgotten where I am. I'm aware that I'm rabbling now. But by the end of 2019, I had worked, or sort of spent time hanging out in squats in Athens, in Plymouth, in Sweden, and we were preparing to bring. People were going to bring objects to Oxford, and we were going to do a live exhibition in Oxford. And then I spent 4 months completing Home Office and visa-related paperwork to bring 12 displaced people, colleagues, from these other countries to spend 10 days in Oxford, and I'd sorted out accommodation and we'd worked the whole thing out. And we'd spent £7,000 because it was excluding accommodation or anything, just on the cost of visas and having paperwork translated into English cost £7,000. And we were everyone was due to arrive, and we were due to start our interpretation workshop and then do an exhibition on the 23rd of March 2020. So I think I swore a bit and then had a bit of a meltdown, and then decided that we had to just carry on. So we went online effectively, and I was able to claw back some of that money and use that money to engage Caleb Parkin, who is my friend, but he's also Bristol City poet. He's a very brilliant workshop, like creative writer, workshop person, and Owen Assels, who's an activist filmmaker, also from Bristol. And then we also worked with Sana Morani, who's an architect at Plymouth, and she helped us to kind of create maps. And so we decided that we couldn't bring objects and people into one place, so what we'd have to do is just riff off it. And somehow I came across this really amazing article by Andrea Roberts and Grace Kelly about remixing as method, and this is basically what we ended up doing. So essentially, Andrea Roberts, she was working with local communities in Texas and documenting the freedom colonies, which aren't very well signposted. There's not very much interpretation, or you basically just wouldn't know that you're in a freedom colony town in Texas. And so she was working with people on the ground, but also descendant families who would come back to the freedom colonies, particularly in a town called Shankleville, named after Jim Shankle, who was a freedman. And she wanted to find ways to co-develop ways to commemorate and to mark these very important towns before the kind of before those memories dissipated and fell away. And so she organised this process where people were invited to share stories, and so they would stand and speak and talk about, my family's connection with this town is blah, but also to bring recipes and music and dance and memories, and also to go to church together. And so through lots of different kind of ways of being together, they practiced what she calls remixing, and she draws on hip-hop methodology, particularly as practiced by Public Enemy. Awesome. So it's this kind of preservation of this ephemeral cultural heritage, but by bringing it together and remixing. She says, we're sampling, layering, looping, storytelling, commemorative events and assemblage. These are practices that already sustain citizen control and participation. I think that's really key. And the other thing is that in the way that they were practicing this and bringing it all together, they then ended up creating the Purple Hull Pea Festival, which is named after a particular pea that came from West Africa and came via the slave trade to Texas. But I think what's really important is that by layering and sampling and looping and involving people and making it relevant to younger people, there's a chance that this can continue. Rather than it becoming this kind of dusty thing that's over there that's not of interest to young people. And this is again what Weil describes as a collective storytelling of and by the people itself that escapes the imposition of the truth of the powerful and disturbs the colonial attempt. So one of the kind of remixings we did, it's only short, but so this is behind the scenes of our digital exhibition, which I haven't shown anyone. I was a little bit worried about it, but I'll show you. I might just speed it forward a bit. Oops.
What is your name?
Oh, I'd better just tell you, this is us. So we took the real questions from the visa application form, the Home Office visa application form, and then we just answered them how we wanted to answer them.
To strangers.
Who does this email address belong to?
The Global Virtual Network.
Explain why you cannot be contacted by telephone call.
Why do I have to give you explanations? It's my telephone and I do with it whatever I want, so none of your business, dude.
What is the main reason of your visit to the UK?
Yeah, but here, I think I was a little bit happier, but it was just like all the memories from India, impact of like, yeah. So the reason of my visit is to learn from the expert country how to professionally commit genocides, organize massive lootings of other countries' heritage, invasions and slavery, but at the same time remain innocent, come out of shit and blood so clean and neat. To commit crime by others' hands and call the rest of the world as terrorists and treat them as low society's worthless human beings. I need to learn this skill from England, world's #1 expert.
I'm glad you laughed because I was a bit nervous about showing that. We didn't actually put that bit in the exhibition. But do, if you are interested, do go to the exhibition because there's loads of stuff there, poems, maps, all sorts. So what does all this mean for? What does all this mean for sustainability? I'll try and wrap it up a bit now. It was really clear to all of our collective that we sustained each other actually, and particularly through the pandemic, we were using prefigurative practices, which comes from anarchism, which basically means treating everyone nicely. I think it's non-hierarchical, and it's a way of recognising that everyone has something to contribute and there's no leader, and that's how we did this project. And so I think I'm aware that there's a lot of criticism of community and collaborative, and kind of within heritage there's been quite a lot written recently, and I'm kind of trying to respond to that at the moment. But I do think that there's also, with this project, we created a community. We didn't kind of parachute into any one particular community. We decided to work together, and then the best parts of a community kind of came together. And I think that people who are operating with care and prioritising well-being, that is more sustainable than a lot of what we currently live through. And then in terms of environmental sustainability, ever since Bill Rathjer's Tucson Garbage Project, archaeology and material culture studies have been really pushing ahead to demonstrate the extent to which waste is absolutely decimating our planet. And there's Rathjer's rubbish dump, there's Danny Miller's work on sort of shifting the focus from production to consumption. There's a recent book called Archaeologies of Waste, which is an edited volume, which is really good. Johnny Gardner's really awesome work on waste landscapes. John's work in the Galapagos, looking at plastic waste. So I think that the degree to which also our commercial colleagues, our commercial archaeology colleagues, are often kind of working at such a quick pace, and no sooner have they kind of got their trowels on the ground, they're being moved on. So we are always looking at what's left behind, but we're also always looking at waste effectively. So we can speak authoritatively on this, and I really think that we need to get to kind of contribute more to discussions about the reuse of buildings and materials, and how we can design buildings to be more sustainable, and we can draw in archaeological understanding of how that was done in the pre-plastic past. And So Donna Haraway talks about how storytelling collects possibilities of recomposing lives and making new kin in hard times. And after Haraway, I am really interested in making kin with non-humans. Again, in COVID-19, in the lockdown, I was lucky enough to be locked down at home in Devon, which was great in many ways, but it was also extraordinarily isolating in other ways. But I found that particularly towards the end of the third lockdown, that really harsh winter one of 21, I had come to know rocks better. I came to know which rocks were better for sitting on. I was more aware of exactly where the seals would be when they came out and what time of day they'd be where. And I think that it made me realise that there's this velocity that we're forced to live under. It's constantly speeding up under capitalism, and it's not healthy. It's not very. It doesn't help us to recognise that we are part of the planet. And when we slow down a little bit, as COVID forced us to, well, some of us, then we stop buying stuff, which is a great thing, and we also we can just live more peaceably, which is more sustainable. And then very finally, Turbo Island, which is the first place that we excavated as homeless with our Homeless Heritage Project, is no more. It's been redeveloped. So that happened just about 5 weeks ago. So I think in terms of this, it's really that I'm glad that we recorded that homeless heritage, because those stories are now documented and photographs were taken, and somewhere there are films and there's interviews, and homelessness as a way of life, or as a problem, as a concern, is documented, and homeless people's voices and the way that they describe it is documented. So I'm really glad that we did that, because I think that even though under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights everyone has access to heritage, homeless people, the Weil in Colombia, actually they are far less likely to survive capitalism than, for example, the Tower of London or the Sydney Opera House. And I think, I think what Deleuze described as a necessary political art, I would say is necessary political archaeology. Thank you.